Hey! In this week's episode of Tech Tip Tuesday, we're going to be talking about writing quilt patterns that have multiple sizes in them and kind of the best practices and flavors that you can have within those different sizes. So we're going to start with talking about block paste sizes. These are the easiest kind of patterns that you can add multiple sizes with because you're basically just adding more blocks to the pattern, right? So a block based pattern with multiple sizes, all your blocks are going to stay the same size. It's just larger sizes have more blocks and rows. That's all that's happening here. So kind of best practices when you're dealing with this kind of a pattern is to use additional table columns to show kind of dimensions and quantities. And that's true in the fabric requirements, but also in your cutting instructions as well. It's also true in some of the kind of piece counts and assembly instructions. I like to put those in tables rather than just kind of putting it in the text. It makes it easier to read and see. And you've got an example of that kind of row assembly table at the bottom, which we're going to talk a little bit more about here in a minute. Another way that you can kind of show quantities that are varying with size is by using kind of a set of brackets. You'll see this multiple ways in patterns. My preferred way is to kind of use a different set of brackets for each size. So for instance, you might have square brackets for the baby size, you might have parentheses for the throw size, and then curvy brackets for like a queen size or something like that, right? And then this goes on. There's multiple of these kinds of brackets that you can use, different styles of them. But basically, each size is going to have its own set of markers, and that's going to be consistent throughout your pattern. So you just kind of define this in the before you begin section. And then when you get into the pattern instructions where you need to say, make X number of HSTs, you can say make 12 for, baby size, and that's denoted by my square brackets, and then 24 for the throw size and 48 for the queen size. It's as simple as that. Again, not my preferred way personally to write patterns with multiple sizes. I'd much prefer to just drop in a short table that shows all of these quantities in the sections where it's relevant. But this is an option if you don't want to have a bunch of tables in your pattern. The instructions are always going to stay the same, right? Because you're making the exact same block with the exact same dimensions for every single size. The only thing that's changing is the quantities, right? That's all that's varying here. And so you're definitely going to want to display dimensions for each size on the cover. Really important. You need to have that somewhere on the cover. My preference is to have it on the front below the title, right? Because that's one of the more important pieces of information on the cover. How many sizes are in this pattern? What are their sizes? So people can decide, yes, this is going to work for my sister-in-law who I'm trying to make a bed size quilt for. Or no, it's not. I need to pick a different pattern, right? And then the final thing here is that coloring sheets and assembly diagrams should be combined. You don't need to have a separate one for every single size and have, 6 pages of assembly diagrams at the back of your pattern. That's totally unnecessary because all we're changing is the number of blocks and the number of rows in each quilt size. That's it. So you can see an example of kind of one of these assembly diagrams on the left here. This was for a baby size in my striptease pattern, right? And so somewhere in the pattern you say, baby size shown, but all sizes assemble similarly, right? It's just so X number of blocks into a row and then so X number of rows together. That's all we're doing here, right? And so often what I will do when I'm in this situation, rather than showing the largest size, which often ends up with a really, really small diagram because it doesn't really like to fit on the page for like a king size quilt. Often what I'll do instead is use an assembly table, which is what you're seeing at the bottom here. So this is an example of what I use, and I generally suggest this to a lot of my tech editing clients as well. So basically you'll have each of the sizes in your pattern. In this case, I've got 6 sizes here, baby through king. And then you'll list the number of blocks in each row and the number of rows needed, right? And so you'll know that if you're making the throw size, you're going to make 5 rows of 4 blocks each, right? It's easiest to see this in a table, I find, but you can also just kind of put this in the text of your pattern if that's easier. But this kind of method is much more helpful in terms of like actually sewing the quilt together than having a massive layout diagram where you've got, 6 blocks across the top and 7 rows or whatever it happens to be, right? Because then you've got to sit there and count all of these things. And the more you have of them, the more likely you are to miscount, which is not good either. So just dumping it into a table like this makes it very easy. Okay, I'm going to make all of my rows first. They're each going to have 4 blocks. So I'll just grab 4 blocks, sew them all together. And then I need 5 of those. Very, very simple. If you have a pattern that's got sashing, cornerstones, and like all of these extra bits, right? Where you're going to have a block row and a sashing row, you can still do the same thing. You're just going to have more rows in this table, right? So you're going to have basically the makeup for a block row and then the makeup and quantity for sashing rows. Another thing that's sometimes helpful to include in these kinds of assembly tables are dimensions as well, right? Because each size is going to have a slightly different dimension. And so you can list the row dimension in just another kind of row in this table. Dimensions are a really important part of the quilt pattern writing process because a lot of people have anxiety about whether or not they're doing it right as they're sewing. And being able to check and make sure that they're getting the right dimensions is like a critical piece to make sure that they've sewn everything correctly before they get too far down the road and the pattern's ruined. They basically just have to start over. So here's an example of what a coloring sheet would look like for a block-based pattern with multiple sizes. Again, you do not need to have a separate coloring sheet for every single size you're doing, just combine them. My preference is to put kind of thick lines between each of the sizes. If you're in an instance where you've got a size like we do on the left here, where it's the same width as another size, it's just a different height, I drop those down on the side. You can also use different colored outlines to kind of correspond with each different size if that makes more sense to you. But basically, you're just showing kind of where that size starts and stops, and they only have one page to print out. They don't have to worry about making sure they print out the right page. So let's talk about the next kind of category of design that you can deal with and how we deal with different sizes for that particular type. So this is what I call a proportionate design. It's basically the exact same design, right? The exact same quilt. It's just larger sizes are bigger, right? This particular pattern is called Homecoming by Lo and Behold Stitchery, and it is the perfect example of one of these proportionate designs. And so what's happening here is that all of your pieces are basically changing size for each different size that you're making, because it's all the same pieces, they're just bigger for the bigger sizes to result in a bigger quilt. So some best practices for this kind of a design is to label all of your pieces, so that you can refer to that label instead of the piece dimensions throughout your pattern, because again, those piece dimensions are changing. I'm going to drop a link to a video about how to do this and best practices for labeling, but really, really helpful here is to make sure that you've labeled all of your pieces and you've labeled them consistently between sizes so that you can just say, hey, grab piece A and piece B and put them together, and the dimensions don't matter. It doesn't matter that those are two different size pieces depending on the size you're making. Again, you're going to want to use additional columns to show dimensions and quantities, both in your cutting instructions and fabric requirements, but also in any assembly tables. You can use that same kind of different bracketed notation to show different dimensions here rather than quantities, right? Because all the quantities are going to be the same now. It's just the dimensions of the pieces that are changing. But again, kind of using the square brackets, the parentheses, the brace brackets, all of that good stuff. You can totally still do that here. You're just going to be showing different sizes. Again, all of your instructions are going to stay the same here. It's just the sizes that varies rather than quantities like before. So you're still going to want to include those dimensions for each intermediate piece, but instead of putting kind of the quantities in a table like we talked about with the block-based patterns, you can put the dimensions in there instead, or you can use kind of the different bracket notations, whichever makes more sense to you. If you have a ton of sizes, like 6 or more, it's probably going to be better to put that into a table and just have like a very small table that says, you know, if you're making the baby size, here's the unit size. If you're making a queen size, here's the unit size, and so on. Again, you're only going to need one coloring sheet and one set of assembly diagrams, and that's because all of the sizes are the same. They're just different proportions. But since none of those diagrams are to scale anyways, it doesn't matter at all. So you're not even going to have lines kind of partitioning off the different sizes like we saw with the block-based pattern. It is literally just going to be one assembly diagram and one coloring sheet for all of your sizes. Sometimes I will see this kind of pattern that has additional borders or things like that to kind of change the aspect ratio of the quilt. So, you know, getting from a throw size that's rectangular to a queen size that's square, you're going to add extra borders on the sides. That's totally fine. You can still combine these diagrams because it's usually just going to be like a solid piece on those sides to just kind of beef up the width of the quilt pattern. So the last kind of flavor of quilt patterns that I see a lot are what I'll call hybrid designs, and they're really just kind of some combination of the previous two. Any kind of medallion quilt falls into this category, right? Sometimes those are proportionate designs where they're just getting bigger, but frequently you will actually be adding additional pieces to make the larger sizes. And it's basically a mixture of changes in both scale and placement that result in larger sizes. And so what you see as an example on the left here is my pattern suit medallion, and this is a block-based pattern. So all of the blocks happen to be the same size, but we've got different placement and different colors in order to get kind of a larger medallion for the larger queen size. In these patterns, it's not infrequent to have sections that only apply to one size. And so throughout the pattern, you need to kind of clearly call out which sizes this applies to in the header for that section so that it's very clear that if you're not making the size, you need to skip to the next section. You're also going to likely need an assembly diagram and a coloring sheet for each size, again, because placement and scale tend to change quite a bit, right? So you can't just rely on all of your pieces being the same. And so these are the patterns where you're going to get to the back and there's going to be 6 different diagrams, one for each size, that need to have separate coloring diagrams. And there's just not really a good way around it. I've tried to write these patterns previously, kind of combining it in various ways to kind of cut down on the page count, and it usually results with confusion in testers. So just don't mess with it. Just do the work and make the diagrams so that it's very easy for your reader. And then the last kind of suggestion that I have is to limit the number of sizes in your pattern to like 3 max. The reason for that is just because you're going to have a lot of different sections and jumping around because you're only going to be following certain sections for certain sizes. And the more of that's happening, A, the pattern's just going to get longer, but B, there's going to be a lot more mental work and mental calories expended to try and follow the pattern. And it just can be too much for your reader if you have more than about 3 sizes. Things just get too hairy. Now, all of the kind of techniques and suggestions that I had for the previous 2 categories apply here, right? So in this particular pattern, we've got different color placements and quantities for each of these blocks. And so I kind of dumped those into a table and would show quantities for each size. So kind of take what applies from the first 2 sections in terms of best practices and apply it where it makes sense if you're writing this kind of pattern. But not all of them are going to apply because, again, it's this fusion of both different types of designs. Alrighty, I hope you found that helpful. If you did, make sure you like and subscribe, and I will see you next week for Tech Tip Tuesday. See ya!